grants him the rights to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, that's Muslims, and pagans, whosoever, and other enemies of Christ.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
And to take all of their possessions, all movable, immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them, and here is the kind of kicker phrase at the end, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery.
In recent years, Dr. Robert P. Jones has added to his extensive work directing the Public Religion Research Institute with 3 books: The End of White Christian America, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and now, on September 5th, the release of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Dr. Jones is back with us this week to explore those themes. Thank you for listening to The State of Belief. To get these important conversations in front of more of the people who need to hear them, we have partnered with Religion News Service, the leading religion journalism organization in the country. And as part of the RNS family of podcasts, there's a next generation podcast I want to make sure you are subscribed to. Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platforms at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping keep these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Having established himself as a powerful voice on the intersection of race, religion, and power with his first 2 books, Dr. Robert P. Jones, CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, is publishing another timely and insightful volume on September 5th. The title is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. And I'm glad it brings him back to State of Belief. Robby, thank you so much for being with us here again.
Thanks, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to start with a quote that is at the top of the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley Institute, which has this statement on its homepage: "Racial reconciliation begins by telling the truth." And that feels to me like a smart place to start with your project, because this feels like truth-telling. How was it to seek the truth for this book?
Well, thanks, Paul. I think that's a great way in. And actually, it's at the heart of what I've been up to for 3 books now, really, is trying to disentangle the mythology and the tendrils, really, of white supremacy that have crept into my faith and the churches that I grew up in, and just how to sort out what stories that I got told about who we are and how we got here are true, and which ones were self-serving and, frankly, cover-ups for what really happened and for the place that my forebears played in some pretty horrific things in this country.
Yeah, it's almost a trilogy. I don't know if you think of it that way, but when I was thinking about talking to you today, I was just thinking about these 3 books: The End of White Christian America, White Too Long, which was really looking at the Christianity that you grew up with and the culture, and then this one, which actually it takes it even a step further. Did you set out to do this, or is this something that a process of discovery kept urging you on and didn't let go of you?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. I wish I could say I had the foresight that, 10 years ago, yes, I plotted out, this grand trajectory, but no, I mean, I think this has been a very much a journey for me, putting one step in front of the other. And as I said, sort of trying to not just tell the truth, but really discover the truth, because part of the challenge is that even for someone like me who I've got a PhD in religion. I went to seminary. I've got a pretty deep well to drink from here, and still am finding that in my kind of middle-aged adult life, I'm having to re-educate myself and really do some sifting and use, these academic tools and sift through family lore and all of it. So yeah, I think the first book, The End of White Christian America, was really more about data, right? It was about demographic change, sorting out what was happening in the country, with the country moving from being majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country, what that was about, and really what that was uncovering, right? Because what it did is it created an opening for different stories about the country to begin to be heard. They've always been told, right? But it began to be able to be heard for people who look like you and me. And then the next book was much more personal, and it was taking it back really into the 19th century and looking at the Civil War in particularly era, when places like the Southern Baptist Convention were birthed, as places to defend slavery, this attempt to make it compatible with the gospel. And my own family's wrapping up with that. And this one goes back even further. So I think it is me kind of continuing to pull on this thread and just follow it, wherever it goes. And in this one, I end up going back really to the 15th century, not to 1492, when we all learned that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but really to the next year, to 1493, where some very significant Christian theology began to coalesce that's still with us today.
Could you talk about that? Because I do think what you're describing sounds like excavation, and that feels really important to be able to see, like, what's the architecture underneath the country that we're living in. And this book does lay plain some of that architecture and some of the foundational ideas and images. And so why don't you talk about that foundational idea? I assume you're talking about the doctrine of discovery.
Right. Yeah. So this thing called the doctrine of discovery, if you had brought that up in a conversation that you and I had right after I'd finished the last book, I wouldn't have had much to say about it, frankly. Vaguely heard of it, but didn't really know much about it at all, and certainly didn't understand its significance for where we are today. But, it's notable that when I think about the big divides in the country, and, at PRRI, we do a lot of polling and trying to sort out policies and attitudes about policies. What's become kind of clear to me is, especially over the last decade, is that our divides in this country are less and less about policy differences and more about identity. There are debates over who the country is, who the we and we the people is, or the our, all these kind of possessive plural pronouns that we use. Who counts? Who's in? Who's out? What does it really mean to be an American? I mean, these big, deep stories. And what it's done is it's brought to the surface these two conflicting streams in American history, and that actually predate American history. And that's kind of what the Doctrine of Discovery gets at. And at the heart of it are two very different and mutually incompatible visions of the country. On the one hand is this vision of a pluralistic democracy, right, where everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity or religion, stands on equal footing before the law. The other one, which has survived alongside of it throughout our entire history, is this idea of America as a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians. Is that who we are? Which of these visions is really who we are? And we can't be both.
Yeah, it crystallizes it so well. The doctrine of discovery was, it was a guiding principle, and it was an excuse. There was some divine sanction. Oh, everything we see is all of a sudden ours. It is ridiculous when you think about it, but it was mandated. Where did it emanate from? Was it the Catholic Church to start with? But certainly it was adopted well beyond that. I'm just wondering, what is the origin story of the doctrine of discovery? And then we can get a little bit into what the implications were.
So, the problem or the dilemma really stems from the quote unquote discovery of these new lands by Europeans that began in the 1400s. And so as it becomes clearer, there's a whole continent, millions of people that have been otherwise unaccounted for by Europeans. So it creates political opportunism, economic opportunism, and it creates a kind of theological dilemma for who are these people? They're not Christian. They've not been exposed to any of this kind of Catholic teaching. And so what happens is there's basically a free-for-all among the political powers to see who can get over there and claim the land the fastest. And so because there's this contest between, in the beginning, it's really Spain and Portugal competing here, and they have a couple of options. They realize they're going to be fighting perpetual wars, or they can appeal to a referee and to sort of get some moral cover for what they're up to. And who do they appeal to? They appeal to the Pope and Rome. And so they say, here are these things. We have these competing claims, and how do we adjudicate them? And it's really remarkable that the church, and at this time, again, this is before the Protestant Catholic split. So there's only one Western European church, and it has the Pope in Rome as the head of it. So when the Pope speaks, this is the moral religious authority for all of Western Europe. And so they get this edict from the kind of earlier one is from 1452, and it is Pope Nicholas V. I want to read just a little bit of this because it's really important to get the flavor of this. There's no holds barred here. And so this is what Pope Nicholas V grants to the King of Portugal at the time, and puts it in very clear language. He grants him the rights to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, that's Muslims, and pagans, whosoever, and other enemies of Christ, right? Wherever placed, and to take all of their possessions, all movable, immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them. And here is the kind of kicker phrase at the end, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, right? So in other words, like whoever isn't killed in the conquest and the vanquishing stage of things, there is a Christian blessing given by the highest authority in the church for these European powers to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. And this is the seed that flourishes, that gives us the entire transatlantic slave trade, that lays the foundation for the kind of genocide toward Native Americans in the Americas, and then the subsequent enslavement of Africans to come in and clear all this land that they've then forcibly removed Native Americans from.
That is absolutely shocking language that I have never heard before. It's revolting and evil, and yet you can see the ramifications of each one of those words.
And we still are hearing echoes of this, right? And DeSantis talking about the benefits that enslaved people received, right, from being enslaved. And that logic is deeply embedded here, because the idea was that whatever harm we Christian Europeans are doing to people in these lands, it is far justified by the fact that we are giving them Christianity and European civilization. Like we're bestowing upon them these gifts of Christianity and civilization, and that outweighs any genocide, any enslavement. Ultimately, those gifts are, that side of the scale is so heavy that nothing can outweigh it. But and that really is the spirit of Christianity that landed on the shores of this continent.
Yeah, save me from those kind of gifts of Christianity. One of the most interesting things about this book is just taking back the history. And many people have done it, but there's just a really interesting, the way you did it in this book is really important, is that 1619 is a really important time, but 1619 actually was influenced by a time earlier than that. And so if you talk about when we're starting the history to come, it complicates that narrative and invites actually the experience of Native American people across the country and puts it in conversation with 1619 and 1776 and 2023. Talk a little bit about those juxtapositions and how you think that is a helpful framework for us to understand our current situation.
Yeah. This is going to be really important, in the current divides in our country. And we've already had this huge fight over, is it 1776? Is it 1619? And I think that was actually a healthy conversation for us to have. And the important work that the 1619 Project did was dislodging, this sense that the country began with a bunch of white men in a room in Philadelphia, right? And that's the image of the beginning of the country. So dislodging that, I think, was a monumental, feat and important. But it does sort of, if we only start at 1619, it does leave out hundreds of years of this kind of connection between the 15th century, right, and the 17th century, of this kind of violent conflict between Europeans and Native Americans. So it leaves out the Native American story in a way that I think is important. So one of the things I've tried to do in this book, whether we're trying to connect up, for example, the story of Emmett Till, the killing of Emmett Till in 1955, but saying that, like, to really understand the full context that made that possible, we have to understand the landing of Hernando de Soto in Mississippi on behalf of Spain with this idea of the Doctrine of Discovery, on board 400 years earlier. If we want to understand the Tulsa Race Massacre in Tulsa, we have to understand the Trail of Tears, that sort of forced removal of Native Americans in the early part of the 19th century that created the state of Oklahoma as we even know it there. If we understand the lynching of African Americans in Duluth in 1920, we've got to understand the Dakota Wars of 1863 and the mass execution of 38 Dakota men in the state of Minnesota, by order, by the way, by none other than Abraham Lincoln.
Right. I think that's in some ways the central themes of the book are those three locations, and kind of going deep into those three locations, Tulsa, and Mississippi Delta.
In and around Tallahatchie County. Yeah.
I thought those were three very interesting choices. My guess is that you could probably find another three, probably another dozen, probably another 20 that would be interesting. How did you land on those three?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the power of these stories is to kind of get you up close and on the ground. But you're right. You could go to almost any state in the country and find these kinds of connections between the kind of efforts that have become more prominent during the Black Lives Matter movement, and history behind that has to do with the genocide and displacement of Native Americans behind that story. So for me, Mississippi is personal. I'm from Mississippi. Grew up in Jackson. This is up in the Delta, but have kind of been following the efforts over the last 20 years to tell the story of Emmett Till on the ground. And, just to give you a little flavor there, if you'd gone to Mississippi 20 years ago, around 2000, there was virtually nothing on the ground marking these events, even though the world knows the story, right? It was the spark of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks said, when she was making this decision to, not go to the back of the bus in Montgomery, she had Emmett Till on her mind. John Lewis talked about thinking about Emmett Till during some of his challenging moments during the civil rights movement. It's this well-known story, but if you'd gone on the ground in Mississippi, there was nothing there. And 20 years ago, a group of Black and white interracial group of citizens decided, we're going to tell the truth and try to get some healing in our community. It had been just buried. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And it has resulted just 2 weeks ago, and President Biden just named a new national monument that'll be administered by the National Park Service that's going to be both in Chicago and in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. So that story will be permanently now told and supported and federally funded. And that was unheard of, 20 years ago. And Tulsa, I think I picked because it was so in the news in 2021 at the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But I did want to connect up the story of the Osage and the Trail of Tears behind that. And then Minnesota, I wanted to kind of make sure I wasn't giving the impression this was only a Southern or a red state phenomenon, right? So I want to go to a good blue state right up next to Canada, can't get much more north than Duluth, and show how these dynamics, are even in a far north state like that are very, very similar.
Tell me about the research, because reading the book, I was learning a lot, which is always kind of embarrassing when these stories they're lying there in plain sight. And yet I'm not the brightest guy in the world, but I'm fairly educated. And some of these stories I just hadn't heard. And it just, so how did you discover things? What was your research like? Who did you talk to? My guess is that the research must have been incredibly painful, but also bring you into contact with people and that you might never have known, and opened your eyes in new ways.
Yeah, well, this was part kind of traditional research, the kind you do, and online and in libraries and books and journal articles and that kind of thing. But it was also a lot of on the ground work, because I did want to make sure that the stories I was telling had a contemporary component of people on the ground in real time, working on these issues. So I spent a few weeks in each of the locations and tried to talk to the kind of people who had rolled up their sleeves and were working together. And in the middle of that, what ends up happening is, you hear a story that you didn't hear before, and you start asking, "Oh, what's that about? Like, tell me more about that." And then you kind of follow that thread. So it was very much a process of discovery of my own again. And I came across, for example, the story in Duluth. There's 2 pages where I actually talk about this story in White Too Long, but it just goes by in passing. It's a quick example. And the more I read about that, the more I realized, oh, this deserves a broader canvas. There's more to say here and more to learn if we really kind of give it a little more oxygen and kind of, tell the story and put it in its historical context. So that one I had from there. Mississippi had personal connections there. And I think what put the Tulsa one on my radar screen was the 100th anniversary. That and the fact that it is one of the, if not the largest, one of the largest kind of racial massacres in the country. 300 African Americans killed in the span of just a few days by their white neighbors who were just roving through the city, indiscriminately killing anyone with dark skin.
We'll take another break now and be back with more of my conversation with Robby Jones. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You're listening to State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Dr. Robert P. Jones. His new book is titled The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. I just happened to see online that a white state representative in Tulsa saying, well, was it racist? We don't know what they were thinking. And trying to whitewash, as you're doing this work, the effort to erase history is going full steam. And it's so nefarious, and it's, out of fear and out of kind of willful ignorance. It can only be just so heartbreaking and disgusting to people who are the descendants and even some who continue to remember it. One of the things that was interesting to me is that there were people in these places who were trying to make something out of it, trying to figure out what could we learn from this? How can we tell this story in a way that invites people in, helps us learn from it, and fashions that community, our country, in a way that will be better into the future. So talk about some of those stories, because that's kind of the second half of the title of the book, is a shared American future. It is so important to tell these stories of the past and then helping us to figure out what to do with those stories in order to make the future different.
Yeah, well, thanks for that turn. I for a book that has the word white supremacy in the title, I do think ultimately it's a hopeful book. I left, the research and writing process feeling more hopeful than I went in. It was mostly because I got to meet all of these people who in their local communities were doing such important work and bringing about healing, truth telling in their communities. In Mississippi, for example, I mentioned that there was this group of Black and white people that came together, but it's a small community. The county seat has 600 residents, right? So it's a very rural place. And so that means that these people know each other and they know each other's grandparents. They know each other's great-grandparents. And in this setting, what it means is that some of their great-great-grandparents owned other people's great-great-grandparents, right? And now they're working together. And they know that. They still carry the same family names, down through. Right. That was what was moving, I think, was seeing actually a descendant of enslavers and a descendant of the enslaved looking at each other, standing on equal footing and declaring we are going to tell the truth And we're going to do that in the service of moving us to a different relationship with each other, right? And in the interest of kind of saying, yes, this hatred we're shining a light on so that we can not go there again, so that we can kind of bring some healing and move forward together. And in Duluth, it was kind of remarkable. That one happened much earlier. So they put this plaza together, this group, and it got put up in 2003, which means that, and it's this beautiful brick plaza with these images of these three men that were lynched and a bunch of quotes around from different people about change and living together and kind of embracing pluralism and democracy. And that space had been there for, nearly 2 decades when the Black Lives Matter movement erupted, right? And so Duluth, like many places, had these spontaneous protests. But in Duluth, which again is a pretty white space, but in Duluth, because they had this civic space dedicated to racial justice, there was this space where people knew to go, right? And it was a space where people could come, they could have these safe conversations. And this is an interesting little tidbit. And the police chief was a descendant of the woman who accused these 3 Black men of raping her, falsely accused them of raping her, and was sort of the instigator of the lynching, and was today the police chief in Duluth. And he knew that history and had been involved in this truth telling, and it really changed, right? The way this white police chief thought about policing in Duluth. And he even talked about, like, we want to keep everybody safe, but we also want to make space, even though they haven't applied for a permit. And even though this is kind of the spontaneous gathering, we're going to not over police it. We're going to kind of let this happen. And it was partly though, because they had this civic space where people knew these kinds of expressions and conversations could find expression.
I wonder what is the next step. These stories are hopeful, and I'm just curious the involvement of the local Native American tribes in any of those locations. Do they feel part of that story? Did, when you would be interviewing them or talking to them, were they making those same connections, or do they have a different narrative that they want us to hear? I'm curious what you found.
Yeah. Well, that part, I think there's still a lot of work to do, and I think that's where the big energy we've seen is around Black and white dynamics, right? It's not that Native Americans haven't been raising these issues, forever, right. but they haven't really, I think, reached the level that the Black Lives Matter movement reached in terms of the kind of general consciousness in the public. So I think they have often felt left out of these conversations around the Tulsa Race Massacre or around the lynching. And so I think they've been supportive. For example, we've seen in some instances in Mississippi, the Choctaw tribe was actually providing behind the scenes support for kind of truth telling efforts around things in Neshoba County, for example. But I think this is kind of a new moment where I think it's one of the things I'm hoping the book will help do is to connect these movements up very clearly. They clearly need to be connected together, and it will change the conversation. Like one place in particular is that we're starting to have some serious conversations about reparations. What does that look like? What does that mean? How can we meaningfully talk about what reparations toward African Americans means, as who are descendants of enslaved people in this country and subject to Jim Crow and all these kind of denials of opportunities systemically for centuries? That's one conversation. And what I kind of learned in this is that, but we're going to have to add a different conversation for Native Americans. It's not really, in reparations may not actually be the right word even. The conversation there is about restoration, like land back, like hashtag land back is the kind of phrase in the Native American context. So it's restitution of treaty obligations and land that's been improperly taken, even outside of what was agreed to in U.S. treaties. So that's a slightly different conversation that I believe these streams are going to merge, but it hasn't quite happened yet. These two things still seem to be a little bit more parallel, but I think there's some real value in bringing them together, if for no other reason that it kind of points to the common thread that's behind all of it, right? Again, the same logic justified by Christianity, white Christianity, that led to the kind of loss of land by Native Americans and genocide is the same logic that led to the enslavement of Africans.
So tell me, for you, as someone who grew up in the church in the South and like me as white male, what has this done to your spirit? because I think it's super important to have it do something to our minds
Yeah.
and, to impact the language we use and the frame of reference. But my sense is that this kind of revelation uncovering that you're doing really has to go to the spirit for us to
Yeah.
truly be impacted in the way that we need to be impacted. These three books have taken a lot, 10 years, and it's has to have impacted some of the way you kind of understand who you are.
Oh, thanks for that question. I think that's right. These are certainly all personal books I mean, really, I think about them as kind of documenting a journey that I just felt like I had to go on, right? To kind of sort things out, to wrestle it to the ground. Again, the thing I'm wrestling to the ground is the entanglement of white supremacy with my faith. And it's just that simple. How do I go about that? And when you have something that has been so deeply entangled for centuries, it's not a simple thing to figure out where one ends and the other one begins. But I think that's part of what I'm really up to. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's about health. It's about spiritual health and integrity. And what I'm realizing is that, like James Baldwin has this line that has just always haunted me, where he said that he and other African Americans he knew often thought of white people as, and these are his words, the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing.
Hmm.
Right. And there's a kind of self-delusion, aspect of this. And the fact that we have not been able to tell the truth about ourselves, means that we're always at a place of not really knowing who we are, not really understanding how we got here. And there's something deeply unhealthy about that. It makes us act in ways that are unhealthy, not only toward ourselves, but to our fellow human beings. And, at the end of the day, we should really want to sort that out. The best metaphor I think of, you and I think talked about this, and I've talked openly about it, but, I had a bout with colon cancer in 2011. And, when you get this diagnosis, it kind of freaks you out. It seems very daunting. And you agree to this treatment that is not a simple road, right? It's surgery, it's chemo, and it kind of brings you to your knees, but you do it because at the end of the day, you hope, right, that there's going to be help at the end of it. And so I think of this in a similar way. While it is challenging to hear some of these stories, I'll just like one quick example. As part of this digging just in my own family, I found out that my grandfather was a deacon at the Baptist Church in East Macon, Georgia. And in the early 1960s, one of his roles as a deacon was to stand on the steps of the church and make sure that only white people entered the church. Right? There was anyone non-white, his job was literally to be a bouncer and to kind of prevent them from entering the church. And this wasn't a kind of wink, wink, nod, nod. This was like an official role for the deacon there. And he was a ex-Navy guy and kind of rough and, could handle himself. And that's why he got the job. That's a hard story to hear. It's a painful story to hear. And all these other stories are challenging, but I think we face them because there is a way in which it helps us move to somewhere better. And, I think that all of our jobs, every generation's job is to take, what we receive from our tradition, from our faith, and we look at it, right? And we sift through it, right? And our job is to sort of like hold on to the best of it. But our job is also to excise the mistakes, the wrong turns, the dead ends, and to use a theological word, the sin, right, that infects, our faith, and make sure we don't pass that on to the next generation. And I feel like we have an opportunity, I think, now because of the moment of reckoning that we're at, to do that work in a way that would have been very hard, I think, for people who look like us to do in previous generations, because there really just wasn't the zeitgeist, right, for doing it. But there is now. And I think leaning into that is a top responsibility, for people who look like you and me, and thinking about what Christianity is going to look like going forward.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because I agree with you, and another word is atonement, which it gets into reparations and things like that. But there is an entire another strain that is virulent right now, which is moving in entirely the opposite direction. which is insistent on covering up the past, insistent on not belaboring those bad things, but actually let's move on. Let's not, so talk to me a little bit about writing this kind of book in the context of the erasure of African American history in Florida, for instance, and these other impulses that are really strong. Like they're not fringy things anymore. These are almost gospel to one of our two major parties, is that we can't do the kind of work that you're suggesting we should do, and instead we need to move on and celebrate how great America is and go that path. So I'm just curious, to introduce the reality that we live in right now and the extraordinary fact that millions and millions and millions of Americans are supporting some of these candidates who I just find unbelievable. You've been looking at the public and religion, and statistically for a long time, and I'm not so interested in latest polls as I'm interested in your general feeling about what it means to go into this next election cycle with all of these currents going against each other.
Yeah. Well, no, thanks for highlighting that. I think that's right. It kind of brings us full circle, I think. So I am going to give you some poll numbers, even though you said you weren't asking for any. There's only one chart in this book, by the way. And it is on this point because the real question is, okay, so there's all this history. Sure, the doctrine of discovery and all that is back there, but how is this really still with us today? You've highlighted some of the ways this is still with us today, but we actually asked a poll question that was the closest thing I could write in a poll to the doctrine of discovery. And so it was an agree, disagree question. And we just put it out there and we said, do you agree or disagree with this statement? God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world. You agree or disagree? Now, among all Americans, it's about 30% of Americans that agree with that statement. So by 2-1, Americans overall reject that statement. But as you said, it flows very differently into our two binary political parties. A majority of Republicans and a majority of white evangelical Protestants agree with that statement. So you rip that straight from the pages of the Doctrine of Discovery, and you've got that. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the Republican Party today is 70% white and Christian. So 7 in 10 self-identified Republicans are white, non-Hispanic, and Christian. That's remarkable, right? In a country that is only 42% white and Christian. And so I think it's no coincidence that the parties that is mostly white and Christian is saying, yes, that's the vision of the country we have. So I think it really is an example of how something that sounds as dusty and old as the Doctrine of Discovery is still animating our divides today. And this question, are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone of every race and every religion stands on equal footing, or are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? That is the question that's being called before us today. And it is the thing that is pushing the great white Christian freakout, on the right.
Wait. The great white Christian freakout.
Yeah.
It's that's a party that no one I know ever wants to be invited to, but yes.
That's the technical term for it. Yeah. Right.
Wow. Yikes.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
But it is a backlash. It's a backlash.
No,
I think,
100%. And it's fear, it's resentment. It's like, and I think that ultimately, that Baldwin quote rattles around in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Where it's like the fear, the resentment, just like, don't tell me that. Don't tell me that.
Well, it messes with my self-delusion. Right?
Totally. So give me 3 things that each of us should be thinking about doing to create a path to a shared American future. Like, I know it's not a how-to book, but I do think it's helpful for us to get a little bit more tangible. And these don't have to be like, Sunday school gospel. They just I'm just wondering, off the top of your head, what are 3 things that you can imagine each of us doing to take the second part of it, to take the awareness and then to begin to walk down a path together. What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I became convinced by even more in this book was the importance of local action, right? And local involvement. All of these stories, they're not denominations doing things. They're not advocacy groups doing things. They are people organizing on the ground in local communities to do things. I think that's super important. So I think local, and it's because you build relationships at that local level. And you can still tell that group of 24 people in Mississippi created a national park for Emmett Till, right? I mean, it can be big.
And they're also the ones who know that story is there.
Yeah, and kind of maybe this, I'm going to count this as two, even though it's sort of maybe a corollary. But I do think, like in terms of churches, a really concrete thing that churches can do. And I know you've got a lot of folks that are kind of leaders or lay leaders or clergy that listen here, but is to kind of ask the question, why is our congregation located where it is? And if you just ask that simple question, right? So this particular land, why are we here instead of somewhere else in the city? All right. So there's a kind of concrete answer to that question. But then if you start peeling back the layers, well, were we here when this was a whites only area of the city? Were we part of a racially restricted neighborhood covenant? Were we part of redlining? In our city, did we follow white flight out to the suburbs? That's how we got here. Like those kinds of questions. And then even deeper, and whose land was this before a white person held title to it? Like what Native American land? And I think getting beyond just the land acknowledgement, which I frankly have very mixed feelings about. I think it's important for consciousness, but it often doesn't go much further than that. But what does it mean? If you're there's still plenty of, neighborhoods named for Native American names, right? Because that's what it was before, the white people divided up into little plots and plunked houses on top of it, or strip malls on top of it. So I think getting really clear about that. And then I think the other thing, I guess, is just deciding that we, people, again, who look like you and I do, I think we got to become convinced that we've got something at stake here. I think all too often this is thought about as a altruistic, even racial justice sometimes is thought about, oh, well, let's see what we owe other people. We're going to do something. And all that's right. I mean, there's certainly the kind of reparative justice claims are very real and concrete. But I do think the thing that many white people miss, and white Christians in particular miss, is that we have something at stake. For ourselves, right? Not just for making things right with others, but again, I came back to this. I think one of the things motivating me is that I was so angry when I first found out the truth, for example, about the founding of my denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, that it was founded to justify slavery. I didn't find that out until I was in my 20s. And I was so mad. And I was mad because I'd been lied to. Right, by my pastors, by my Sunday school teachers, by my teachers, at least some of whom knew that story, but didn't tell me. It wasn't until I got to seminary that I actually got that story. And again, I just don't think you can't live into integrity, into a future with any integrity, when your past is built on a lie, right? And getting clear about that, and kind of wishing, that we all live into a fuller knowledge of the truth. And not to kind of, I'm going to quote the Bible here, but that the truth will set you free thing is real, right? It really is. And I think that's the thing. It hasn't been.
How dare you quote the Bible?
I know. So the overwhelming thing has certainly not been shame, or I have certainly been brought to tears from time to time from reading these things, but the overwhelming thing has been, for me personally, like an experience of healing, finding integrity, and finding relationships that I wouldn't have found if I hadn't been on this journey.
I think that
last one is really important, because I think it's an opportunity for your life to be richer
if you go in with a curiosity and a willingness to listen and learn and have your life, your awareness expanded, but also made so much richer. And that's I think
I'm very eager to hear what your next book is. I don't want you to,
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, but I just think in some ways, what I mean by that is I feel like I'm eager for this question because I think you've named it a couple times, and I want to kind of end on this, that we are in this moment where it's not about parties and it is about those who have a different vision for the future of our nation, for the future, and who are looking for a shared future that is diverse and celebrates that, rather than one that elevates a certain race, religious tradition, gender, and ideology over all the others. And I do think it's as stark as that. And a lot of your work has pointed us to that awareness. So Robert P. Jones is the author of The End of White Christian America and White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. His latest book is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path to a Shared American Future. Dr. Jones is founding CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute. Robby Jones, I thank you so much for being with me here today, and it's really a pleasure, and good luck with this book. It's The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future.
Thanks, Paul.
And that's all the time we have for this week's State of Belief. Please be sure to subscribe to the new and improved podcast called The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/new podcast. Subscribe to The State of Belief today. I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can also be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like these are heard by sharing this program with family and friends. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part, both on and off the air. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at State of Belief. And share State of Belief with the people in your life. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I'll be at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and I'll be interviewing people throughout the week, and you will be able to hear those conversations. Until then, I'm Paul Raushenbush on State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.